Kitsch band video for the laughter wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It drifted through the marble lobby of First National Bank like a cold draft slipping beneath a locked door, quiet enough to sound polite, sharp enough to cut. Every head turned toward the old man. Walter Hayes stood just inside the revolving glass doors, motionless for a heartbeat as rainwater dripped from the brim of his faded canvas cap onto the polished floor below. His heavy work boots, dark with fresh mud, left uneven prints across the spotless white marble. The security guard frowned immediately. "You can't walk in here like that, sir." Walter looked down at his boots as if noticing them for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Been working since before sunrise." The guard sighed dramatically. "There's a mat outside for a reason." A few customers exchanged amused glances. Someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Looks like he took a wrong turn from the construction site." A ripple of chuckles followed. Walter didn't answer. At 84, he had long ago learned that silence often carried more dignity than arguments ever could. His denim jacket was faded almost white along the shoulders. The stitching had been repaired by hand more than once. His weathered hands, scarred, cracked, and permanently stained by decades of honest labor, held nothing more than a worn leather envelope, its edges softened by time. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Nothing about him suggested importance. To everyone in the lobby, he was simply another old laborer who had wandered into a place where expensive suits spoke louder than calloused hands. Behind the reception desk, a young relationship manager glanced up from her computer. Her practiced smile disappeared the moment she noticed the mud. "Sir," she called, trying to remain courteous, "loan assistance appointments are downstairs." Another employee leaned closer and murmured just loudly enough. "He probably needs help delaying his mortgage." More laughter. Walter slowly approached the reception counter. Each heavy step echoed softly through the vast lobby. His boots squeaked against polished stone. Rain tapped gently against the towering glass. Windows overlooking Main Street. The young manager folded her hands. "Can I help you?" Walter nodded once. "I hope so." She waited. Instead of explaining, Walter carefully placed the old leather envelope on the marble counter. She glanced at it without opening it. "If you're applying for financial assistance, we'll need you to schedule an appointment." "I'm not applying." "Then, are you making a payment?" Walter's pale blue eyes lifted from the envelope. "For someone else." The young woman blinked. "I'm sorry." He spoke with the same calm voice. "I'm here to pay off Mrs. Evelyn Carter's mortgage." Silence. For less than a second. Then someone near the waiting area laughed. A man in an expensive tailored suit shook his head. "The whole mortgage?" Another customer smirked. "With what?" "Pocket change." Even the security guard couldn't hide his grin. The relationship manager gave Walter an apologetic smile, the kind reserved for people she believed didn't understand how the world worked. "Sir, Mrs. Carter's remaining balance is..." She stopped herself. She hadn't even checked. Because it didn't matter. Men wearing mud-covered work boots didn't walk into private banks to eliminate six-figure debts. They came asking for extensions, not writing miracles. Walter simply rested one weathered hand on the leather envelope. "I know exactly how much she owes." His voice never changed. "I've been counting for 37 years. The smile disappeared from the young manager's face. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached for the envelope. The envelope was heavier than it looked. The young relationship manager, Emily Brooks, hesitated before opening it. Years of banking had taught her to recognize false hope before it reached the counter. Most envelopes carried overdue notices, payment extensions, or desperate letters explaining why another month was needed. This one felt different. Still, she wasn't expecting much. She slid a single sheet of paper halfway out, then stopped. Not because she understood what she was seeing, because the number printed on the cashier's check looked impossible. She quietly pushed the document back inside before anyone else could read it. "There must be some mistake," she murmured. Walter simply waited. Patience had become part of him decades ago. He had waited through monsoon seasons that lasted forever. He had waited beside hospital beds where every heartbeat felt borrowed. He had waited outside front doors before telling families that sons were never coming home. Compared to those moments, waiting inside a warm bank was nothing. Emily excused herself and disappeared through a frosted glass door leading toward the manager's office. The whispers immediately returned. "Probably counterfeit. Looks fake. Poor old guy. He doesn't even know what a cashier's check is." Walter heard every word. None of them reached his eyes. He stood with both hands resting lightly on the counter, looking out through the rain-streaked windows toward the parking lot. His truck sat alone near the edge of the lot. It was nearly 40 years old. The faded blue paint had surrendered to rust in several places. The driver's door carried a long scrape where a trailer had caught it years earlier. There was nothing remarkable about it. Just another old pickup belonging to another old working man. Every morning before sunrise, Walter drove that truck across 3 counties. Some days he repaired broken fences. Some days he replaced storm-damaged roofs. Other days he spent 10 hours splitting fallen oak trees into firewood for families too old to do it themselves. People hired him because he was dependable, not because he was fast, not because he was cheap, because if Walter Hayes promised he'd arrive at 7, his truck rolled into the driveway at 6:55. Always. The money he earned never stayed in his pocket very long. His jeans were patched. His jackets were repaired instead of replaced. His boots had been resoled so many times that the cobbler jokingly claimed only the laces were original. Walter had simply smiled. They still get me where I need to go. No one knew where the rest of the money went. No new truck. No vacations. No expensive dinners. No fishing boat. No retirement home overlooking a lake. Nothing. Even the waitress at Annie's Diner, where Walter ate breakfast every Thursday, once asked why he still worked at his age. He had stirred cream into his coffee before answering. Because someone still needs me. She assumed he meant himself. She was wrong. Back inside the bank, the elevator doors opened. Branch manager Richard Collins stepped out with Emily beside him. His gray tailored suit fit perfectly. His polished shoes reflected the ceiling lights. He glanced once toward Walter, then toward the muddy footprints crossing the marble floor. His expression tightened. "Mr. Hayes, is it?" Walter nodded. "I'm Richard Collins, branch manager." His tone remained polite, professional, measured, but beneath it lived the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to deciding who belonged in his bank and who did not. Emily handed him the envelope. Collins removed the cashier's check. His eyes narrowed. For the first time that morning, the smile disappeared from his face. He read the amount again, then looked slowly back at the old man in worn work boots. "You've requested," Collins said carefully, "to satisfy Mrs. Evelyn Carter's remaining mortgage." Walter answered before he could continue. "Not requested." A calm pause settled over the lobby. "I'm here to finish a promise." No one laughed this time. Even the rain against the tall windows seemed quieter. Collins lowered his eyes to the check once more. There was only one question left. "Mr. Hayes, where did this money come from?" No one spoke. Richard Collins kept staring at the cashier's check as though the numbers might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. They didn't. The amount was real, large enough to erase every remaining dollar Mrs. Evelyn Carter owed on her home. He carefully placed the check back inside the envelope before looking at Walter again. "Mr. Hayes," he said, choosing every word with professional caution, "a transaction of this size requires verification." Walter gave a small nod. "I expected that." Collins studied him. The old man's face carried no anxiety, no frustration, no impatience, just the quiet composure of someone who had already lived through days infinitely harder than this one. Most customers became defensive when questioned about large sums of money. Walter merely waited. That unsettled Collins more than anger ever could. "I'm also required to ask where these funds originated." Walter answered without hesitation. 43 years. Collins frowned. "I'm sorry. 43 years of roofs." He counted softly. Fences, barns, broken porches, storm cleanup, snow removal, anything honest that needed doing. The manager blinked. Walter wasn't avoiding the question. He had answered it. Every dollar had been earned one day's labor at a time. Behind them, someone scoffed. A sharply dressed businessman folded his newspaper. "Come on. You expect anyone to believe an old handyman saved that much?" Another customer laughed. Maybe he found oil in his backyard. Several people smiled. One woman even shook her head sympathetically. Poor old man. He probably believed hard work still beat mathematics. Walter didn't acknowledge a single voice. His eyes wandered toward a framed photograph hanging behind the reception desk. It showed the bank's grand opening nearly 40 years earlier. The building looked newer then. So did everyone in the picture. Time changed everything. Except promises. Collins glanced toward Emily. "Please verify the issuing institution." She hurried back to her computer. Her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. Routing number. Verification code. Issuing bank. Confirmation request. The waiting felt longer than it really was. The lobby had grown strangely quiet. Even those who had mocked Walter now watched with reluctant curiosity. Emily's computer chimed. Her eyes widened. She read the confirmation twice. Then a third time. Finally, she looked up. It's authentic. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. The funds cleared yesterday. The businessman lowered his newspaper. Someone near the coffee station stopped stirring cream into a paper cup. Collins inhaled slowly. Authentic. There would be no easy explanation now. He looked back at Walter. If I may ask, why Mrs. Carter? That question lingered in the air. Walter's weathered fingers rested on the envelope. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked through the rain-covered windows toward the gray sky beyond the parking lot. As though searching somewhere many years away. Finally he spoke. Her husband once carried me. No one understood. Collins waited. So this is about an old debt? Walter slowly shook his head. No. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the falling rain. You repay debts. A long pause followed. You keep promises. The distinction seemed small. To Walter, it was everything. At that very moment, the front doors opened again. A cold gust of rain swept through the lobby. An elderly woman stepped inside, clutching a worn umbrella with trembling hands. Her coat was several winters too old. Her shoes were carefully polished despite their cracked leather. She looked exhausted. She looked frightened. Emily recognized her immediately. Mrs. Carter? The old woman forced a weary smile. I came to ask if there's any way to delay the foreclosure. Silence spread across the lobby. Walter slowly turned. For the first time since entering the bank, emotion flickered across his face. He quietly removed his cap. Good morning, Evelyn. The widow froze. She stared at the old man in muddy work boots. Then tears instantly filled her eyes. Walter, you came. For a long moment. Neither of them moved. The rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows, but inside the lobby, the world seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn Carter stared at Walter as though she were looking at someone she hadn't expected to see again. Not today. Not here. Perhaps not ever. She tightened both hands around the curved handle of her umbrella. Walter, she whispered again. You shouldn't have come. Walter's weathered face softened into the faintest smile. I told you I would. The words were simple, but something inside them carried decades of history. Richard Collins glanced between the two elderly figures. You know each other? Neither answered immediately. Evelyn lowered her eyes. I've known Walter for most of my life. Her voice trembled, though she fought to steady it. He never missed a Christmas. The customers looked at one another. She continued. When the roof leaked after the storm, he fixed it. When my furnace quit during winter, he repaired it. When the porch collapsed, he rebuilt it. Walter quietly shook his head. It wasn't much. Evelyn looked at him, almost offended. It was everything. Silence settled over the lobby once again. Emily noticed something then. The sleeves of Walter's faded denim jacket were frayed near the cuffs. His hands carried fresh cuts. The mud on his boots wasn't from yesterday. He had been working this morning. At 84, while most men his age rested in warm houses, Walter had climbed roofs, lifted lumber, driven nails. Richard Collins folded his arms. If you've been helping Mrs. Carter all these years, why didn't you simply tell her about this? Walter looked toward Evelyn. I couldn't. Why not? Because she would have refused. Evelyn gave a weary laugh through tears. He's right. I would have. She wiped her eyes with the back of one hand. Walter's been trying to help me for years. He'd leave groceries on my porch and pretend the church sent them. He'd mow the lawn before sunrise so I couldn't pay him. He'd fix broken windows while I was at doctor's appointments. I always knew it was him. She smiled faintly. He always denied it. Several people in the lobby lowered their eyes. The businessman who had mocked Walter moments earlier quietly folded his newspaper without another word. The security guard shifted uncomfortably beside the entrance. No one found the old man amusing anymore. Collins glanced at the mortgage file on his tablet. Evelyn Carter. Widow. 79. Delinquent for 11 months. Final foreclosure hearing. 10 days away. He looked back at her. Were you planning to sell the house? Her answer came almost instantly. I tried. But nobody wanted an old farmhouse that needs repairs. She swallowed hard. My husband built that place himself. Every word became heavier. Our children were born there. He planted every oak tree. I promised him. Her voice finally broke. I'd never leave it. Walter quietly removed his cap. His fingers tightened around its worn brim. He knew every inch of that little farmhouse. Every fence post. Every loose floorboard. Every crack in the old chimney. He had repaired them all. Not because someone hired him. Because every nail he drove honored a promise made long ago. Emily looked from Walter to Evelyn. There must be more to this. Walter didn't answer. Instead, his thumb slowly brushed across an old scar running along the side of his hand. A pale white line, almost hidden beneath decades of weathered skin. His breathing became slower. The sounds of the bank faded. The rain, the whispers, the fluorescent lights. All of them disappeared beneath another sound. A distant, rhythmic thumping. Rotor blades. Slow, heavy, growing louder with every heartbeat. Walter closed his eyes for only a second. When he opened them again, he wasn't seeing the bank anymore. He was seeing a valley half a world away, and a young Marine named Thomas Carter, still smiling. Just moments before everything changed. The steady hum of the fluorescent lights disappeared. In its place came another sound. The deep, rhythmic thump of helicopter blades echoed across a valley wrapped in smoke and dust. The polished marble floor beneath Walter's boots dissolved into loose red earth. The smell of fresh coffee vanished. Now there was only the scent of cordite, burning diesel, hot steel. Walter Hayes was 23 again. The year was 1971. The afternoon sun hung low over a narrow valley where shattered trees leaned like broken sentries. A medevac helicopter circled overhead, searching for a place to land, while rifle fire cracked across the ridgeline. Walter pressed himself behind a shattered stone wall, breathing hard. His left shoulder burned. Blood soaked through his sleeve. The radio operator beside him wasn't moving anymore. The evacuation zone was still 200 yards away. Too far. Every open step invited another bullet. Across the shattered road, a young Marine sergeant crawled toward him. Thomas Carter, only 26. Broad-shouldered. Calm. The kind of man who smiled even when everyone else had forgotten how. You still breathing? Thomas called over the gunfire. Walter managed a tired grin. Barely. Good enough. Thomas slid beside him, checked the wound, and tightened the field dressing with practiced hands. You'll make it. Walter looked toward the helicopter. Not. Unless somebody carries me. Thomas followed his gaze. Then, without hesitation, he slung Walter's arm across his own shoulders. Walter shook his head immediately. No. Leave me. Thomas laughed. You always did have terrible ideas. Another burst of fire struck the wall, sending chips of stone into the air. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled through the radio. 30 seconds. Thomas looked toward the landing zone. Then back at Walter. We're going home. Walter tried to protest again. Thomas wouldn't let him. With one powerful movement, he lifted Walter onto his back. Every step forward became a battle against mud, exhaustion, and incoming fire. Walter could feel Thomas stumbling beneath the weight. Still, he never stopped moving. Halfway across the clearing, another explosion threw dirt into the air. Thomas lost his footing. Both men crashed hard onto the ground. Walter tried to crawl. His injured shoulder collapsed beneath him. Thomas grabbed the back of his jacket and pulled him forward. Come on. You're almost there. The helicopter was now only yards away. Its rotors whipped dust into a blinding storm. Crew chiefs waved frantically. Hurry. Walter reached the open door first. Strong hands grabbed his arms and pulled him inside. He immediately turned back. Thomas. The young Marine smiled. A smile Walter would remember for the rest of his life. I'm right behind you. Then everything changed. A sharp crack split through the roar of the helicopter. Thomas stopped. His body stiffened for the briefest moment. He looked down. Dark red slowly spread across the front of his uniform. Walter lunged toward the open door. No. The crew chief held him back. We have to lift now. Thomas took one unsteady step. Then another. He reached the helicopter just as the aircraft began to rise. His hand caught the edge of the doorway. Walter grabbed his wrist with both hands. For one endless second, neither man spoke. Thomas looked directly into Walter's eyes. There was no fear, only peace. And one final request. If you ever meet Evelyn. His voice was barely audible beneath the rotors. Don't let her fight the rest of this war alone. Walter tightened his grip. We're both going home. Thomas smiled again. You will. His strength faded. His fingers slowly slipped from Walter's hand. The helicopter climbed higher. Walter watched helplessly as his friend grew smaller beneath the cloud of swirling dust. The valley disappeared below, but the promise remained. Not written on paper, not recorded in military archives, etched somewhere far deeper. Inside the conscience of the man who survived. The memory shattered as quickly as it had come. Walter stood once again inside the quiet bank lobby. Rain traced thin lines down the tall glass windows. His old hand still rested on the worn leather envelope. For a moment, he hadn't been holding paper. He had been holding Thomas's wrist. Walter drew one slow breath, then looked toward Evelyn. I told him. His voice was almost a whisper. You would never carry the rest of the war by yourself. Silence filled the bank. This time, no one dared break it. No one moved. The silence that settled over the lobby felt heavier than anything words could carry. Richard Collins looked down at the cashier's check once more, then at Walter, then at Evelyn. For the first time in his 22 years of banking, the transaction in front of him no longer looked like numbers on a balance sheet. It looked like a lifetime. He cleared his throat. Emily. Yes, sir. Process the payment. She hesitated. The entire amount. Collins nodded. The entire amount. Emily swallowed and carefully carried the envelope toward the secured operations desk. Every employee nearby stopped what they were doing. The cashier verified the routing number again. The accounting supervisor confirmed the issuing institution. A compliance officer checked the transfer authorization. Every screen returned the same answer. Verified. Cleared. Irrevocable. No fraud alerts. No holds. No restrictions. Everything was legitimate. Emily slowly pressed the final confirmation key. A soft electronic tone echoed across the department. Transaction completed. The words appeared across her monitor in bright green. She stared at them for several seconds before looking toward her manager. It's done. Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then he walked around the counter instead of remaining behind it. No one at the bank could remember him ever doing that for a customer. He stopped directly in front of Walter. His posture had changed completely. So has it? Walter asked quietly. Collins nodded. Mrs. Carter no longer owes this bank a single dollar. Evelyn covered her mouth with trembling hands. What? Richard turned toward her. Ma'am. He offered a gentle smile. Your mortgage has been paid in full. The umbrella slipped from Evelyn's fingers. It struck the marble floor with a hollow clatter. No. Her knees weakened. Emily rushed forward just in time to steady her. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. Richard picked up the stamped documents from the printer. Across the top, in bold letters, were the words every homeowner dreams of seeing. Mortgage satisfied. Account closed. He placed the papers into Evelyn's shaking hands. They're yours. She stared at them without blinking. 32 years of monthly payments. 11 months of sleepless nights. 10 days from foreclosure. All of it. Gone. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. She looked at Walter, unable to speak. You? Walter gently shook his head. No. He glanced toward a framed photograph resting on the edge of her paperwork. It was an old picture of Thomas Carter in marine dress blues. He did. Several customers followed Walter's gaze. Only then did they understand. The payment had never been about money. It was the final chapter of a promise made beneath helicopter blades more than 50 years earlier. The businessman who had laughed first quietly removed his glasses. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. The security guard stepped toward Walter. I owe you an apology, sir. Walter smiled kindly. You don't owe me anything. The guard lowered his head anyway. I judged you before I knew you. Walter looked at the muddy footprints stretching across the polished marble. They'll wash the floor. He paused. Just try not to judge the next pair of work boots that walk through those doors. The young guard couldn't answer. He simply nodded. Emily quietly wiped tears from her eyes. She had spent years approving loans based on income statements, credit scores, and financial histories. But she had never witnessed wealth measured by sacrifice. Richard Collins extended his hand. Walter accepted it. The handshake lasted only a moment. Yet Collins understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his career. Some customers arrived carrying fortunes. Others carried character. Only one of those could survive a lifetime. Walter reached for his faded cap. He placed it back on his silver hair and turned toward the exit. Mr. Hayes, Richard called after him. Walter stopped. I don't think Mrs. Carter is the only person who owes you something today. Walter smiled without turning around. I didn't come here to collect. He rested one weathered hand on the door. I came here to finish. And with that, the old veteran in muddy work boots stepped back into the rain, believing the story was finally over. He had no idea someone was already waiting outside. Someone who had spent months searching for the man who had disappeared from military history. Someone who recognized the name Walter Hayes the instant it appeared on the bank's transaction records. Walter had almost reached his truck when he heard footsteps behind him. Mr. Hayes. The voice was young, breathless. He turned slowly. Emily stood beneath the bank's entrance canopy, the rain falling just beyond the concrete overhang. She held an old leather-bound ledger in both hands. I think this belongs to you. Walter looked down. It wasn't his. Richard Collins walked out moments later, carrying another item. A faded metal cash box. We found this in Mrs. Carter's mortgage file. Walter frowned slightly. I've never seen it. Collins nodded. I don't think anyone has. The bank had inherited hundreds of paper files after acquiring a small rural lending office years earlier. Most had been digitized and forgotten. During the final paperwork, one of the archive clerks noticed the unusual box attached to Evelyn Carter's original loan documents. Across the lid, written in fading black ink, were 4 simple words. Do not discard. Inside, there wasn't money. There were receipts. Hundreds of them. Handwritten. Yellowed by time. Emily carefully opened the ledger. Every page listed a date, a job, a payment, and one identical note written in the same steady handwriting. Deposit for the Carter Promise Fund. Week after week, month after month, year after year. Roof repairs, fence building, tree removal, snow shoveling, replacing windows, cleaning gutters, small jobs, hard jobs, dirty jobs. Every paycheck had been divided. A little for rent, a little for food, the rest for the promise. Emily's voice trembled. The first entry, she looked up, is 43 years old. Richard slowly turned another page. The deposits never stopped. Not during recessions. Not during harsh winters. Not after Walter broke his hip. Not even after doctors advised him to retire. Every month, without fail. The final entry had been written only 3 days earlier. Last payment. Promise complete. No signatures. No explanation. Just those 2 words. Walter stared quietly at the old handwriting. He had forgotten the notebook even existed. I started writing everything down after Thomas died, he said softly. So I'd never be tempted to quit. Emily looked at him in disbelief. You worked your whole life. For this? Walter smiled faintly. I worked because I knew how. He looked toward Evelyn, who still stood inside the lobby holding the mortgage release against her chest. The promise simply gave every day a destination. Richard felt something tighten in his throat. For years, he had measured people through account balances and investment portfolios. Standing before him was the wealthiest man he had ever met. Not because of what he owned, because of what he had quietly given away. At that moment, the archive clerk hurried through the front doors. Mr. Collins. She held a thin military envelope in her hand. I found this tucked beneath the original loan agreement. The paper was brittle with age. The seal had already been opened decades before. Across the front, written in careful cursive, was a single name. Walter Hayes. Walter accepted the envelope with both hands. He immediately recognized the handwriting. Evelyn's. He unfolded the letter carefully. The ink had faded, but every word remained clear. Walter, if you're reading this, then you've ignored every promise you ever made to me. A faint smile crossed his face. Emily and Richard exchanged puzzled glances. Walter continued reading silently. His eyes grew moist. When he finally reached the last line, he closed the letter and held it gently against his chest. Richard spoke quietly. What did she write? Walter looked through the rain toward the little farmhouse in the distance, barely visible beyond the gray morning. Then he answered. She knew. Knew what? That I was saving the house. He paused. And she spent 43 years praying I'd spend the money on myself instead. For the first time since the morning began, Walter's composure cracked. Not from grief, not from exhaustion, but from the unbearable kindness of 2 people who had spent half a century trying to repay each other's love. No one in the bank spoke, because everyone understood the same truth at exactly the same moment. The mortgage had never been the greatest debt. The greatest debt had always been gratitude. The rain had almost stopped. Only a fine mist lingered above the empty parking lot as Walter reached the driver's side of his old pickup. He slipped the letter back into his jacket pocket. One hand rested on the worn door handle polished smooth by 40 years of use. He had done what he came to do. The promise was finally over. Or so he believed. Behind him, the bank doors opened again. Not with hurried footsteps this time. With dozens. Walter turned. Employees were quietly walking outside. Not because anyone had ordered them to. Because no one wanted to stay behind the counter anymore. Richard Collins led them. Emily followed. Then the tellers. The loan officers. The security guard. Even the maintenance worker who had been mopping the marble floor stood near the entrance, still holding his mop. No one spoke. Richard carried a small wooden box. He stopped a few feet in front of Walter. Mr. Hayes. His voice was different now. Not managerial. Not official. Simply human. When First National acquired the Carter mortgage, we also inherited this. He opened the box. Inside lay an old brass key, attached to a weathered wooden tag. Written across the tag were 3 faded words. Carter Family Home. Richard lifted the key carefully. This was scheduled to be surrendered after the foreclosure. He looked toward Evelyn, who had slowly walked outside with tears still glistening on her cheeks. It never belonged to the bank. He extended the key. It belongs to its family. Walter looked at Evelyn. Instead of taking it himself, he gently placed the key into her trembling hands. You keep it. She closed both hands around it, as though it were made of glass. I don't know how to thank you. Walter smiled. You already have. She looked confused. When Thomas carried me. A tear escaped before she could stop it. Around them, the parking lot remained perfectly still. No phones were raised. No cameras flashed. No applause broke the silence. Only respect. The security guard stepped forward. Without saying a word, he bent down, picked up the muddy floor mat Walter had apologized for earlier, then carefully wiped away every footprint leading from the entrance to the truck. Not because the floor needed cleaning, because those footprints suddenly felt too important to erase carelessly. Emily noticed. So did everyone else. Richard quietly removed the small brass nameplate from his suit jacket. It bore nothing more than his name and title. He looked at it for a moment, then slipped it into his pocket. Titles suddenly seemed much smaller than character. Walter climbed into the driver's seat. The old engine hesitated once, then rumbled to life with the familiar growl of a truck that had earned every mile it had traveled. Before closing the door, he looked one last time toward the bank, toward Evelyn, toward the people who only hours earlier had laughed at the mud on his boots. Now they simply stood together beneath the gray morning sky, watching, learning, remembering. Walter tipped the brim of his faded cap. Not like a hero, just like an old working man saying goodbye after another day's job. The pickup rolled slowly toward the exit. Its tires carried bits of wet earth onto the pavement. No one moved until the truck disappeared around the corner. Only then did Richard Collins quietly say the words everyone else was already thinking. We spent all morning believing that old boots measured a man's worth. He looked down at the faint traces of mud that still remained near the entrance. They never did. They only showed us how far he had walked, to keep a promise. Far down the road, Walter drove toward another small town. Another fence waiting to be repaired. Another roof waiting to be patched. Because promises may end. But purpose never does. Walter Hayes never returned to First National Bank. He didn't come back for a ceremony. He didn't come back for recognition. And he certainly never came back to hear people call him a hero. By Monday morning, the muddy footprints on the marble floor had been washed away. But no one inside the bank had forgotten where they had led. Something had changed. Not in the building. In the people. The security guard was the first. From that day forward, he greeted every customer the same way, whether they stepped out of a luxury sedan or an aging pickup with rust along its doors. He never again judged a pair of worn work boots. Emily Brooks made another change. A framed copy of the mortgage release no longer sat in the archives. Instead, she kept a handwritten note inside the top drawer of her desk. Whenever a new employee asked about it, she would simply smile and read one sentence aloud. Never confuse simple clothes with a simple life. Richard Collins carried the lesson even further. Months later, when the bank introduced a customer service training program, he opened every class with the same story. He never mentioned the amount of the cashier's check. He never spoke about the mortgage. He only described an old man who walked through the front door wearing mud-covered boots. Then he asked a single question. What did you see? The answers were always different. A laborer, a farmer, a handyman, someone who needed help. Richard would quietly shake his head. No, what you saw was yourselves. Across town, life slowly returned to normal. The Carter farmhouse remained exactly where it had always been. Every spring, flowers bloomed beneath the front porch Thomas had built with his own hands before leaving for war. Every autumn, smoke curled gently from the old stone chimney Walter had repaired more times than anyone could count. Evelyn still placed 2 cups on the kitchen table every Sunday afternoon. One for herself, one beside the window, not because she expected anyone to arrive, but because gratitude deserved a place at the table. As for Walter, he kept working. Another fence, another roof, another storm-damaged barn. If someone tried to pay him more than he asked, he politely refused. If it's fair, he would say, it's enough. One crisp October morning, nearly a year after the mortgage had been paid, a little boy watched Walter repairing a broken gate outside the edge of town. The child tugged on his grandfather's sleeve. Who is that old man? The grandfather looked across the field for a long moment. Then he smiled. Just a good neighbor. Walter overheard the answer. It made him smile too. Not because it was incomplete, because it was complete. He had never wanted to be remembered for medals, or battles, or sacrifices. If people remembered him simply as someone who kept his word, that was enough. The autumn wind stirred the tall grass. Walter picked up his worn toolbox, climbed into the old blue pickup, and drove slowly toward the next job waiting somewhere beyond the hills. The road stretched ahead, quiet and familiar. Behind him, a promise had finally come to rest. Ahead of him, another day of honest work waited beneath the open sky. And somewhere, beyond the reach of memory and time, a young Marine named Thomas Carter could finally keep smiling. Because the last promise between brothers had been kept. Not with speeches, not with medals, but with 43 years of quiet faithfulness. Sometimes, the greatest victories leave no headlines. Only homes that remain filled with light. Quiet moral respect isn't measured by rank, wealth, or appearance. It's measured by the promises we keep when no one is watching. Koan hung loi hua kong duok kok tren bia de hei ghi trong sach su. Chung duok kok, trong tung gay lao dong lang le qua mot con nuoi. Vadu moi la dan du kong bao geo phi.